There are moments in life when everything changes, not through catastrophe, but through something deceptively small. For Brian Turner, that moment was a single sheet of paper taped to his front door. It fluttered gently in the warm breeze of an ordinary Saturday morning, but its contents would spark a war that would shake the foundations of his quiet suburban neighborhood forever. Brian had never been the type who looked for conflict. He had purchased his modest home in Pleasant Ridge because it seemed peaceful, safe, and family-friendly. The kind of place where neighbors waved, lawns stayed trimmed, and streetlights flickered to life like clockwork. But beneath the pastel illusion of suburban bliss was something far more sinister. Control. More specifically, HOA control. The Pleasant Ridge Homeowners Association was notorious among residents, a power-hungry council made up of nosy retirees and self-appointed neighborhood royals who spent their days walking the streets with clipboards and measuring tape. Their mission? Enforce their version of perfection at any cost. Violations could be issued for anything: slightly leaning mailboxes, visible trash cans, or front doors painted in unauthorized shades of red. Brian had always flown under their radar. He paid his dues, kept to himself, and followed the rules. Life was too busy for petty drama. Between his full-time tech job, raising a young daughter alone after his divorce, and helping his aging mother with errands across town, HOA politics had never crossed his mind. But everything changed that summer. It had been a brutal heat wave, the hottest the region had seen in years. Day after day, the sun blazed down mercilessly, turning lawns into brittle yellow wastelands. Water restrictions had been enforced citywide due to drought conditions, and homeowners were encouraged to conserve water or face penalties from the county. And everyone complied, and soon the once lush lawns of Pleasant Ridge faded to shades of brown. But nobody panicked, because everyone was in the same situation, or so Brian thought. When he pulled into his driveway that morning, coffee in hand, and saw the paper stuck to his front door, he assumed it was another generic reminder from the HOA. Something about the block party or recycling guidelines. But as he stepped closer, his stomach tightened. The heading screamed in bold red letters, "Notice of violation. Immediate action required." His hands tightened around the page as he read. The HOA claimed his lawn violated Section 14B of the Community Maintenance Code. Grass must be maintained in a healthy green condition at all times. Failure to comply would result in a fine of $100 per day until the issue was resolved. The letter stated that he had 72 hours to restore lawn appearance to community standards or face escalating penalties and possible legal action. Brian felt a slow disbelief settle into his bones. Every lawn on his street looked exactly like his. Dry, patchy, sun-scorched. He walked to the sidewalk and scanned the neighborhood. House after house, the same thing. But there were no violation notices on any of their doors. Only his. A hollow anger began building inside him, fueled by the unfairness of it. He had done nothing wrong. The heat wave was out of his control. Sprinkler systems were useless without water pressure. And now, somehow, he was being singled out. He walked to his mailbox, hoping for some kind of explanation, but found only another envelope from the HOA. Inside was a formal invoice, already billing him $200 for 2 days of non-compliance, starting before he even received the notice. And at the bottom, signed in harsh black ink, was the name, Karen Whitaker, HOA President. He knew the name. Everyone in Pleasant Ridge did. Karen Whitaker Wadd, as the unofficial tyrant of the neighborhood, a woman who treated HOA bylaws like holy scripture. She was known for stalking the streets with her phone camera, snapping photos of violations to add to her growing archive of neighborhood offenses. Rumor had it she once had a man's car towed because his wheels were touching the curb at a non-regulation angle. Another time, she reportedly wrote up a teenager for having too many backyard birthday balloons. People feared her. But Brian wasn't afraid. He was furious. He spent the next hour reading through the HOA handbook, looking for some rule, some clause, anything that made sense of this attack. He found nothing. The lawn guidelines were vague and subjective. There was no definition of healthy green condition, nor any mention of drought exceptions. He remembered something one of his neighbors had told him early on, that Karen didn't actually enforce the rules fairly. She enforced personal grudges. But why him? He was quiet, respectful, friendly when needed. He helped his neighbors carry groceries and waved to kids on bikes. He didn't throw loud parties, didn't park on the street, didn't do anything that might irritate the HOA. So why target him? Then he remembered. A week earlier, he had returned home to find Karen yelling at a delivery driver who had briefly parked in front of her house. The man had apologized, but she wouldn't let it go. She had stood there berating him, acting like he had committed some unforgivable crime. Brian had watched for a moment before stepping in, not to start anything, just to diffuse the situation. He had calmly asked her to let the man finish his job, pointing out that blocking him was delaying the entire neighborhood's packages. Karen had given him a long, venomous look before storming away. A cold realization settled over him. This was revenge. The violation notice, the fines, they weren't about grass. They were about power, control, payback. He considered letting it go, paying the fine, hiring a lawn service, doing whatever it took to make it stop. But something inside him rejected the idea. He had spent too many years being passive, going along to get along, avoiding confrontation even when he was right. But this time, he couldn't back down. If he surrendered, he wouldn't just lose money, he'd lose his right to live in peace. He decided to fight. But he also knew the HOA played dirty. He'd heard stories about residents who had tried to push back and failed. They had been buried under fines, liens, and legal pressure until they either surrendered or sold their homes. Karen knew the system better than anyone, and she was ruthless enough to weaponize every rule. To beat her, Brian would have to be smarter. He began researching that afternoon, diving deep into HOA law. He discovered a truth that changed everything. HOAs were powerful, but not unstoppable. They were bound by state regulations and legal limits, especially when it came to selective enforcement, harassment, and abuse of power. Karen may have thought she was untouchable, but the law said otherwise. Still, beating her in a legal fight would take time and resources. He needed something else in the meantime, a way to turn his lawn violation into something bigger, something that would expose Karen for who she really was. And then, like a spark in dry grass, an idea struck him. If Karen wanted to make his lawn a problem, then he would make his lawn impossible to ignore. Not by fixing it, but by transforming it. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to start something far bigger than a neighborhood dispute. He was about to start a movement, and it would begin in the very place the HOA tried to control most, the front yard. Every plan begins as a small idea, simple, almost fragile. At first, Brian's concept felt insane even to him, something that would draw attention, stir curiosity, and disrupt the HOA's grip over Pleasant Ridge. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If Karen wanted to punish him over his lawn, then he would turn his lawn into something that would put Karen and the HOA under a spotlight. A spotlight so bright they couldn't hide behind rules or lies anymore. But he had to be careful. Every move had to be legal, strategic, and above all, unpredictable. He spent 2 days gathering information and preparing. He didn't water his grass. He didn't remove the violation notice. In fact, he left it taped to his front door like a badge of honor. The HOA wanted a battle. They would get one. His plan began early on a Wednesday morning, long before the HOA board made their daily rounds. Where others saw a dead lawn, Brian saw a blank canvas. He loaded his truck with supplies and began. Neighbors walking by slowed down to watch, confusion written across their faces. From a distance, it looked as though he was tearing up his yard, but in truth, he was reinventing it. It started with mulch. Instead of trying to revive his dying grass, a pointless effort in the drought, he covered the entire lawn with rich, dark mulch. But it wasn't random. He arranged it in winding pathways, leaving large, circular sections open. By noon, people had already stopped to ask him what he was doing. Some watched from across the street, whispering, wondering. Before long, even Karen herself drove by slowly, glaring from behind her tinted SUV window. She didn't stop, but she didn't need to. The message was clear. She was watching. That evening, Brian received another HOA letter in his mailbox. It wasn't a fine, but it was close. It demanded clarification of ongoing yard alterations and warned that unapproved landscape modifications were prohibited. The letter insisted he submit a landscaping approval form before making any changes to his property. But Brian had anticipated this. He reread Section 16 of the HOA guidelines, the exact section Karen had hoped he hadn't studied. Landscape. Modification approvals were required only when installing permanent fixtures or altering property boundaries. Mulch was neither. It was cosmetic, temporary, perfectly legal. The next morning, his retaliation evolved. While most residents were at work, Brian transformed each open circle of his mulch design into something unexpected. Mini garden beds. But he wasn't planting flowers, shrubs, or anything purely decorative. Instead, he planted produce, vegetables and herbs, tomatoes, basil, kale, lettuce, green onions, cherry peppers, even a small section for strawberries. Pleasant Ridge had never seen anything like it. He had discovered something important in his research. State law protected homeowners who planted sustainable gardens during drought conditions. A bill had been passed years ago, created to promote water conservation by encouraging residents to grow edible plants instead of grass. HOAs were not allowed to fine or penalize residents who removed lawns in favor of drought-tolerant edible landscaping. Karen had walked into a legal trap without even realizing it. Neighbors began stopping by more frequently, some curious, some amused, others quietly admiring the transformation. Brian explained nothing. He just worked, quietly, steadily, purposefully. He installed small wooden borders around each bed and erected a simple chalkboard sign near his driveway that read, "Community Garden Project, coming soon." It wasn't just a message, it was bait. Later that afternoon, the HOA sent a third notice, this one aggressive. It accused Brian of running an unapproved community operation and warned that commercial activity was prohibited in the neighborhood. They demanded he remove his sign immediately. He read the letter slowly, almost smiling. Karen had made her first big mistake. She had assumed the worst from the sign, assumed it meant business, assumed it violated rules, assumed she could threaten him into stopping. But assumptions were dangerous. He walked outside, picked up the chalkboard, and without removing it, simply erased the word community and replaced it with personal. Now it read, "Personal Garden Project, in progress." Karen had no grounds, no violation to threaten, no rules to hide behind. As days passed, the garden took shape. Wood trellises rose where cucumbers would soon grow. Raised beds filled with rich soil replaced dusty dry patches. Neighbors walked by and smiled, pointing out new plants each day. Children stopped to ask questions. Even strangers from other streets came to see it, curious about the transformation. But not everyone was pleased. On the fifth day, Brian woke to find an HOA inspector, clipboard in hand, standing on his lawn, taking photos again. The man didn't speak. He just scribbled notes and walked away. Hours later, Brian received yet another letter, This one accused him of violating HOA Aesthetic Standard 4C, the rule stating that all front yards must maintain uniform neighborhood appearance. That phrase, uniform neighborhood appearance, was vague enough to be dangerous. It meant nothing and everything at the same time. It was a catch-all rule, a powerful tool for HOA abuse. And for the first time since this began, Brian felt a twinge of concern. If the HOA leaned on vague language like that, they could drag him through hearings, fines, even court. He needed backup. He needed allies. That night, he took a walk through the neighborhood. He paid attention, not to houses, but to people. He watched for families struggling like his, people frustrated with HOA oppression. The woman who had been written up for having a small wheelchair ramp. The retired man who'd received fines for storing tools in his truck bed. The single mom fined because her trash can stayed at the curb 12 minutes too long. One by one, he recognized something. The HOA didn't protect the community. It preyed on it. And suddenly, everything became clear. This wasn't just about a lawn anymore. It was about power, control, freed. And Brian wasn't alone anymore. Not really. On day 6, he made his boldest move yet. He set up a small wooden box on a pole at the edge of his yard, a donation box. And above it, a new sign. Free vegetables. Take what you need. The garden wasn't even fully grown yet, but he had bought fresh vegetables from a local farm to fill baskets at the front yard. Cucumbers, tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, fresh herbs. He labeled them neatly, and beside them he placed a stack of simple flyers that read, "Tired of unfair HOA rules? You're not alone. Let's talk." By sunset, the flyers were gone. By morning, the box was full of notes. Some shared stories, some offered support, some asked for help. A few asked something else entirely. What's the plan? Brian didn't know it yet, but the war had officially begun, and the HOA was about to realize they had picked the wrong lawn to fight with. By the end of the week, the quiet suburban routine of Pleasant Ridge had been disrupted. Nothing dramatic, no shouting, no chaos, but something was shifting. People lingered longer at the end of driveways. Neighbors spoke to one another who hadn't spoken in years. The donation box outside Brian's yard had become a message hub. Residents slipped folded notes inside like secret letters of rebellion. The idea of resistance, once unthinkable, was slowly becoming real. But rebellion never goes unnoticed for long, especially by those desperate to maintain control. On Monday morning, Pleasant Ridge woke to a new alert email from the HOA. Unlike the usual monthly newsletters or gentle reminders about street parking, this message was cold and hostile. It warned residents of growing non-compliance within the community and claimed certain individuals were attempting to undermine HOA standards. It insisted that the HOA was within its rights to enforce rules for the safety and appearance of Pleasant Ridge. And though the email never mentioned Brian by name, it was crystal clear who the target was. By noon, another envelope appeared in his mailbox. But this wasn't just a violation. This was an escalation. The letter stated that Brian's property was now officially under HOA disciplinary review. He was ordered to attend a mandatory hearing in 2 weeks. If he failed to comply, the HOA would begin legal proceedings to enforce fines and potentially place a lien on his home. Brian sat on his porch, reading the letter over and over. It was the HOA's declaration of war. Still, fear didn't grip him. Instead, it sharpened his resolve. He knew Karen wouldn't stop. She was escalating because she felt threatened. That meant his plan was working. But it also meant he couldn't afford to slip. He had to stay ahead of her, legally, strategically, and publicly. Later that evening, Brian visited his mother. He hadn't told her much about the HOA conflict yet, wanting to spare her the stress. But as he sat with her in her quiet living room, he realized he needed something more than legal loopholes and vegetable beds. He needed purpose. He needed a why. And as he watched his mother struggle to stand using the armrest of her chair for support, he found it. When his father passed away 5 years earlier, money had been tight. Brian had done everything to help her stay in her home and keep her independence. But medical expenses were relentless. Insurance covered less than it should. Repairs on her aging home piled up. She would never admit it, but she needed help. Real help. He thought about the HOA and their obsession with telling people how to live. He thought about neighbors stuck under their thumb. He thought about the flyers in his donation box asking for help. And in that moment, his plan evolved. This wasn't just about resisting the HOA anymore. It was about building something useful, something that helped people, something they couldn't attack without exposing themselves as villains. The next morning, Brian added a new sign outside his house. Neighbory, Wood Farm Stand, coming soon. Fresh produce by donation. All proceeds help local families. He knew the HOA would hate it. They would call it commercial activity. They would threaten him again. But this time, he had state law protecting him. Non-profit home gardens were legal. Community agricultural stands were legal as long as they operated under donation-based systems. He had already contacted the county and filed the paperwork. His lawn was now registered as a non-profit microfarm. Legally, he had just turned his home into protected property, and not even Karen Whitaker could stop it. Within 2 days, the first version of the farm stand was ready. It was simple but charming. A wooden table with baskets of produce and a small lockbox for donations. A handwritten board read, "Take what you need, pay what you can." By afternoon, people began stopping by. Some dropped a few dollars. Some took vegetables with shy thanks, and some simply stopped to talk, finally unafraid. Then something unexpected happened. A local food blogger shared a photo of the stand online. The post spread fast, first through the town, then into neighboring communities. Comments called Brian a hero. Some praised the garden as inspiring. Others said this was what community really looked like. But more importantly, people started talking openly about the HOA. People were finally calling it out for what it truly was: bullying disguised as order. The HOA board panicked. Karen, especially. She sent another certified notice claiming Brian had violated HOA Section 22, which prohibited operating any business from a residential property. She demanded the immediate removal of the stand and threatened daily fines. But this time, Brian already had his next move prepared. He wrote a short response, calm, professional, and devastating. He explained that the farm stand was legally recognized as a charity effort under Toronto state nonprofit law. He referenced state code and attached supporting documentation. He also pointed out that HOA bylaws were superseded by state law in matters of community welfare. Unless the HOA wanted a lawsuit for interfering with charitable relief, they had no grounds to stop him. He sent the email not just to Karen, but to every resident in Pleasant Ridge. By evening, copies of the letter had spread like wildfire. The farm stand became more than a charity table. It became a symbol. It represented freedom from the HOA's grip. Proof that they could be resisted. And that terrified Karen. The next day, the retaliation turned ugly. Someone vandalized the farm stand. The baskets were knocked over. Vegetables were smashed across the sidewalk. The donation box was gone. A note was left behind, pinned to a splintered piece of wood. "This isn't a farm. This is a neighborhood. Follow the rules or leave." There was no signature, but everyone knew who sent the message. Brian cleaned up in silence. The neighbors watched. Slowly, one by one, people approached, not with pity, but with determination. They helped rebuild the stand. They brought their own garden produce to donate. One neighbor even added a cooler for eggs and milk. Another brought flowers to make it look inviting again. And as the sun set over Pleasant Ridge, Brian realized something. This wasn't his fight anymore. This was everyone's. The HOA had tried to scare him. Instead, they had united the entire neighborhood. But the battle was far from over. The mandatory HOA hearing was approaching. Karen would be waiting, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. She had already proven she would go further than anyone expected. The real war hadn't even started yet. The day of the HOA hearing arrived with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the entire neighborhood. Despite the warmth of the afternoon sun, the atmosphere felt cold, expectant, and uneasy. For weeks, tension had spread through Pleasant Ridge like cracks in a frozen lake. The garden had become a symbol of defiance, one that inspired many, but threatened others who clung desperately to the illusion of order upheld by the HOA. People who had never cared about lawn regulations now found themselves pulled into a quiet civil war that was as much about power as it was about grass. Inside the HOA clubhouse, the same beige building where block parties and holiday gatherings once took place, the long, rectangular conference room was arranged like a courtroom. At the far end, a plastic folding table formed the board panel, draped with a faded banner that read, "Pleasant Ridge HOA, preserving community standards since 1982. Behind it sat the board members, Mr. Thompson, a retired accountant who rarely spoke, Linda Ruiz, a former school principal who used rules like weapons, Ron Mayers, a real estate agent whose smile never reached his eyes, and at the center, gripping her binder like a judge clutching a gavel, Karen Whitaker. The chairs in the room were nearly full. Residents had shown up, not just out of curiosity, but because they sensed something important was happening. Some thought this was just another petty HOA dispute. Others knew better. They had seen people pushed out of this neighborhood. They had seen homeowners bankrupted by fines, beaten into submission by bylaws and bureaucracy. They were tired of being afraid. And somehow, one man's lawn had become the battleground on which they would finally make a stand. Brian entered the room with calm purpose. He carried a folder, not thick like Karen's binder of violations, but neatly prepared. He didn't come alone. 3 neighbors sat beside him. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived in Pleasant Ridge for 26 years and walked with a cane. Paul Jackson, a mechanic and father of 4, and Maria Santos, a nurse who had recently moved in and already received 3 unjustified violations. They were not there to speak for him. They were there to stand with him. A low hum filled the room as whispered conversations darted between rows. When the clock struck 6 p.m. exactly, Karen slammed a gavel onto the table, a dramatic touch, unnecessary, but signaling her desire to control the room. This hearing, she announced, was to address ongoing and escalating violations committed by homeowner Brian Turner of 14 Sycamore Lane. She claimed his property was an eyesore, a threat to the image of the neighborhood, and a commercial operation in disguise. She insisted he had repeatedly refused to comply with HOA orders and that disciplinary measures were now required. She listed supposed violations one by one: failure to maintain a green lawn, unauthorized landscape modifications, operating a business on residential property, erecting signage without HOA approval, causing neighborhood disruption, encouraging civil unrest. That last accusation stirred the room. Some residents frowned, others murmured disapproval. Karen was no longer hiding her agenda. She was attacking him personally. She was angry, and anger made her reckless. Brian didn't respond immediately. He let her speak, let her display her pettiness before the entire neighborhood. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair with a smug expression, certain that she had built an airtight case. But Brian opened his folder. His voice was calm and steady, not emotional, not aggressive. He began by presenting legal documentation. The HOA had attempted to penalize him for drought-damaged grass, but he referenced California State Water Conservation Law 142.4, which prohibited fines for non-watering during a drought emergency. Karen's first violation had been illegal. Then came State Bill 992, protecting homeowners who replaced lawns with drought-tolerant landscaping. His mulch and garden beds were fully legal. He held up a copy of the bill. Murmurs grew louder across the room. People leaned forward. Some began taking notes. Then he addressed the accusation of running a business. He revealed documentation that his garden stand was registered as a non-profit charitable activity. He produced a letter from the County Office of Agricultural Affairs approving his project. Commercial violations? Invalid. He wasn't just defending himself. He was dismantling the HOA's case piece by piece. Karen interrupted, her voice sharp, accusing him of twisting legal language. She declared that the board still reserved the right to remove any property deemed a disruption to neighborhood harmony. She quoted HOA Rule 27B, a vague clause that gave the board broad authority over aesthetic consistency. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Brian, as if daring him to challenge her. He did. He lifted a stack of papers, resident testimonials, statements from neighbors who supported the garden stand, residents who had used it to feed their families, people who had been inspired by it. He presented statements alleging bullying by the HOA, selective enforcement, harassment, abuse of power. And then he played his final card, evidence of discrimination. Over the past weeks, he had quietly gathered photographic proof that the HOA did not enforce rules fairly. He displayed printed images of other dead lawns, no violation notices. Other homes with unapproved yard fixtures, no fines. Even a board member with an illegal shed, ignored. The board had selectively targeted him. This violated Section 51 of the HOA Fair Practices Act, which made selective enforcement illegal. If the board pursued penalties against him alone, they would be in violation of state law and subject to legal action. The room exploded with murmurs. Karen's expression cracked. Her face flushed with anger, but also fear. Brian wasn't finished. He revealed copies of every violation letter he had received, and everyone sent before his 72-hour grace period expired. The HOA had violated due process. He then asked a question, not to the board, but to the room. What kind of community did they want to live in? One where neighbors helped each other, built together, supported families in need? Or one controlled by intimidation and fear? He stepped back, letting the silence sink in. Karen struggled to regain control. She attempted to move the board to immediate disciplinary action, but the other members hesitated. Linda Ruiz asked for time to review the legal documents. Mr. Thompson, silent until now, admitted he was unaware of Brian's protected rights. Even Ron, the slick real estate agent who always sided with Karen, remained quiet, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Karen called for a private board vote. They disappeared into a back room. While they deliberated, residents gathered around Brian. Some patted his shoulder, some shook his hand. Others simply thanked him. Something had changed in that room, a shift of power. When the board returned, their announcement felt forced. The disciplinary hearing was postponed pending further investigation. Brian's fines were suspended. The garden would remain, for now. But Karen made one thing clear. This wasn't over. Her eyes burned with silent fury. She had lost control of the room, but she hadn't lost the war. Not yet. As Brian left the clubhouse, a soft breeze brushed across his face. He should have felt relieved, but he didn't. The hearing wasn't a victory. It was a warning. Karen wasn't done, and whatever she did next, she would make sure it hurt. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the quiet neighborhood of Willow Creek had ever witnessed. What began as a petty dispute over a patch of dead grass had turned into a full-scale war between one homeowner and the HOA board. The board members had expected to intimidate a single resident into submission, but instead they had unknowingly provoked someone who refused to back down. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook resilience for defiance. And now they were learning a painful lesson. Pushing too hard could cost them everything. The harvest market continued to flourish in spite of the HOA's growing aggression. Every Saturday, the crowd seemed to grow larger. Vendors lined the street, families brought children, musicians played guitars under the open sky, and people mingled freely. The once empty lawns and silent sidewalks had now turned into a lively community hub. People from outside neighborhoods came just to buy fresh honey, bread, flowers, produce, and handcrafted items. The market became a symbol of freedom, of entrepreneurship, and of community spirit. But the HOA saw it as a threat, not just to their so-called neighborhood aesthetics, but to their authority. And authority, once challenged, became something they were desperate to reassert. Their new campaign began subtly. Anonymous letters slipped under doors claiming the market was driving down home values. Fake complaints were filed through city hotlines alleging code violations, noise disturbances, and health risks. HOA board member Shelley Thompson began attending vendor booths just to harass sellers, demanding business licenses and proof of insurance while pretending to act on behalf of the county. None of it stuck. But the HOA had no intention of giving up. What they lacked in legal grounds, they tried to make up for with harassment. One morning, signs appeared throughout the neighborhood reading, "Unsafe, illegal, unapproved business activity, boycott the harvest market." They were staked into lawns, nailed to trees, and zip-tied to mailboxes. It didn't take long to figure out who was behind it. The signs were printed on HOA letterhead. The smear campaign escalated further when the HOA hired a private security company to patrol the neighborhood during the market. They stationed 2 uniformed guards near the property line with clipboards, taking pictures of people and writing down license plates. They claimed it was for safety. In reality, it was intimidation, but even that didn't work. The guards soon realized that the event was peaceful and well-organized. On more than one occasion, they were seen buying lemonade and pastries from vendors during their shifts. By the end of the second week, one of the guards even brought his family to the market. With community support growing stronger, the HOA board made a public statement during their next meeting. They announced their intent to introduce an emergency amendment to the HOA bylaws, an amendment specifically designed to shut down the harvest market. Hidden behind legal wording, the amendment would outlaw any type of business activity within the neighborhood, including yard sales, tutoring, babysitting, lemonade stands, and anything considered commerce. Violators would face fines of up to $5,000 per incident. The board believed this amendment would force compliance. What they didn't anticipate was the reaction from the residents themselves. People were furious. Parents who ran small side businesses from home, retirees who sold crafts, teachers who offered tutoring, college students who did online freelancing. Suddenly, everyone realized that this wasn't just about one man and his lawn. This was a battle for personal freedom in their own homes. The next market day, a crowd formed, not to shop, but to protest. Handmade signs waved across the street. Stop HOA abuse. Let neighbors live. Freedom over control. News crews arrived with cameras and microphones. The story spread online, first through local Facebook groups, then through Reddit, then across YouTube channels that specialized in HOA horror stories. The market became more than a marketplace. It was now a movement. Then came the HOA's boldest move yet. 2 weeks before the vote on the anti-business amendment, the board sent a cease and desist order. It claimed the property was being used for commercial purposes in violation of zoning laws and HOA rules. It threatened a lawsuit for damages to neighborhood property values, traffic congestion, and emotional distress to board members. Along with the letter was a notice of lien filed against the house for $178,000 in unpaid fines. The HOA gave a deadline, 10 days, to shut down the market permanently and pay the fines, or legal action would begin. It was their ultimatum. But they had made a mistake. In their arrogance and their desperation to assert control, the HOA had finally overplayed their hand. They believed they had found their victory. Instead, They had set the stage for their collapse, because they assumed everything was on their side: money, lawyers, and power. What they didn't know was that everything was about to turn against them, because while they were preparing their lawsuit, a lawsuit was already being prepared against them. A team had been quietly building a case. A county zoning specialist had joined the fight. So had an attorney specializing in HOA abuse. And a small group of residents had gathered over 40 sworn statements documenting HOA harassment and illegal board activity. The HOA was about to walk into a courtroom believing they could bulldoze another homeowner. They had no idea they were walking straight into a trap, and it would be too late by the time they realized it. The morning of the court hearing arrived cloaked in tension and anticipation. The air outside the county courthouse felt heavy, not with fear, but with the weight of a fight that had been building for months. Crowds had already gathered long before sunrise: neighbors, reporters, supporters from nearby towns, and even people who had followed the story online. They held signs, wore Harvest Market t-shirts, and chanted for justice. For them, this wasn't just about a homeowner and his yard anymore. This was about standing up to abuse of power. The HOA board members arrived dressed in expensive suits, confident and arrogant as ever. Their attorneys flanked them, carrying briefcases full of legal documents they believed would crush any resistance. They expected another simple victory, another homeowner too broke, too tired, or too afraid to fight back. They had no idea what was waiting for them inside. The judge, assigned to the case, was known for her no-nonsense approach. She valued facts over theatrics and despised anyone who tried to manipulate the courtroom. The HOA's lead attorney began by confidently presenting their case. The property had been used for commercial purposes in violation of HOA bylaws, state zoning laws had been ignored, and residents were supposedly suffering emotional distress. They presented photos, letters, complaints, many of which were fabricated or exaggerated. The HOA board watched smugly, believing the case was as good as won. But then came the defense. Instead of a single homeowner standing alone, an entire legal team rose from the opposite table. They didn't begin with emotion or protest. They began with documentation. Hundreds of pages of it. A massive binder labeled "Evidence of HOA Misconduct" was placed before the judge. First came the financial audit. A certified forensic accountant had reviewed the HOA's financial statements from the past 3 years. He uncovered unauthorized spending, missing funds, and unapproved transfers to personal accounts belonging to board members. The judge's eyebrows rose as she examined bank statements showing HOA money used for personal vacations, restaurant bills, and even luxury purchases. The courtroom murmured in disbelief. Then came the zoning expert. He calmly explained that the Harvest Market had been operating entirely within legal limits. The property was classified as residential agricultural, which allowed gardening, produce sales, and seasonal markets. In fact, the community's founding documents had once encouraged small local farming. The HOA had deliberately hidden this information from residents. Next came witness testimony. Dozens of them. Residents took the stand one by one, describing harassment from HOA board members, illegal threats of fines, unauthorized liens on property, and the board's misuse of authority. A retired teacher shared how the HOA threatened to fine her for tutoring students in her home. A widowed mother spoke about being accused of illegal business activity for selling handmade quilts online. A teenager explained how the HOA shut down his charity lemonade stand. The HOA tried to object, but the judge allowed every witness. She knew exactly what she was seeing: abuse of power. Then came the final blow. A county official stepped forward with a folder containing complaints filed over the last 2 months. Complaints supposedly from residents against the Harvest Market. But an investigation found that over 70% of the complaints came from the same IP address, located in the home of HOA President Gregory Marks. In other words, the HOA fabricated harassment complaints to shut down the market. Silence fell across the courtroom. The HOA board members stared straight ahead, pale and expressionless. Their attorney put down his pen and leaned back in defeat. There was no recovering from this. The judge leaned forward, hands folded, and began delivering her ruling. She declared that the HOA's liens were illegal and immediately void. She ordered all fines removed from the homeowner's property record. The cease and desist order was invalidated. The harvest market was legally permitted to continue operating. But she wasn't finished. She turned her attention directly to the HOA board. She suspended the HOA's authority effective immediately, pending a full state investigation. A temporary receiver would be appointed to manage the HOA's accounts. An external audit was ordered. Civil penalties would be pursued for misuse of funds. Board members Gregory Marks and Shelley Thompson were referred to the district attorney for criminal investigation into fraud and harassment. They were escorted out of the courtroom by deputies as reporters shouted questions. The HOA had, not just lost. They had been dismantled. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded the defense team and residents. Cheers erupted as the crowd celebrated the victory. The harvest market owner stepped forward and addressed them, not with anger or revenge, but with quiet strength. He thanked the community for standing together. He thanked the legal team for believing in fairness. And he reminded everyone that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to stand your ground. Weeks later, Willow Creek was transformed. The harvest market expanded permanently onto a nearby vacant lot, officially approved by the county. Vendors grew in number. A children's play area was added. Live music became a tradition every Saturday. Local farmers began donating produce for community food drives. It was no longer just a market, it was the heart of the town. The HOA board was replaced with a new committee, one elected by residents, built on transparency and service rather than control. Monthly meetings became open to the public, and decisions were voted on fairly. The new HOA made a point to support small businesses, not destroy them. And the old house with the once-dead lawn? It now had lush garden rows and a handmade wooden sign at the entrance that read, "Where they tried to bury us, but forgot we were seeds." In the end, what began as a fine over-dead grass turned into something far bigger. A movement. A reminder that power belongs to the people who choose to stand up, not to those who try to silence them. And as for the man who started it all, he stood on his porch each weekend and watched as families laughed and vendors sold their goods. The HOA tried to crush him. Instead, they helped him build something that would last forever.